All right. Welcome back. I suppose you put it on mute for a second. Welcome back. We are now going to have John Dotson present. John is a poet, a sculptor, a writer, a playwright, formerly a teacher, an editor. He is in the middle of writing a book about, well, not about, but let's say with, prepositions are always so tricky, you know, with Dylan Thomas. He's been involved with the Gebser Society for 22 years. And I'll let him tell us what he's going to speak about. But anyhow, here is John Dotson.
Greetings to all of you whom I know and those of you whom I am knowing. Karen, I appreciate your remark. In Gebser conferences, in my experience, presentation after presentation, discussion after discussion, something happens that I think Gebser is using the term syneresis. Lovely term, not likely to catch on, but I'd be great if it did. And that is where we find resonances and interweavings and fractals that spiral around and interconnect as we move along. In some ways, I'm feeling rather Kierkegaardian in the sense of fear and trembling and the sickness unto death. My presentation is a song, although it may not always seem like that, and a dance. I often find that it's helpful to organize things for me in a spiral. One can start at the outside of the spiral and move in, or start at the, you get it, a vortex, a multi-dimensional resonating Kleinian vortex. Jeremy says you need to spotlight.
Right.
So I ask your patience and your compassion. My presentation is in 5 parts. Those are the Gebserian 5. Archaic, magic, mythic, mental, integral, as if these could be thoroughly distinguished. I am particularly concerned with the ever-present archaic. The title came to me and required itself. So come with me. I could give you GPS coordinates to an exact space, a corner of a bedroom in a modest house in the old frontier country of northeastern Tennessee, Daniel Boone country. But for now, in this moment, it is enough to let us travel together time waves to a once upon a time occurrence. Squinch, 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 squinch. Step after step, hear the footsteps, they are coming close. Squinch, squinch, A steady pace, many feet slowly moving up a flight of steps from the underworld. Squench, 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 coming up from the underworld, this acutely alarming sound, this immediacy. And so it was coming for me, only in the darkness, only in the deepest silence beneath the silences of the night. I couldn't think about telling about this, not to anybody, because I knew this sound was destined to be in my hearing alone. This was my secret childish fate, to hear this threatening advance of footsteps. Squinch, squinch. I had to encounter this alone in my child mind, fixating on the basement way of the house, the only flight of steps in the house, descending into that sunken burial space. Squinch, squinch. These anonymous footsteps, ceaselessly climbing, sometimes faster, sometimes slower, but relentlessly, invisible entities never to be spoken of, out to get me, or maybe I was already gotten. Such was the innermost private secret of the beingness of being me. It was with a sudden twinge when the awaring came to me that what I was hearing was in truth the rush of blood through my own ears. This awaring was a jolt. I can still feel this arrival, what it was and what it is when I still hear that sound in the darkness of the day. The forces down there have continued always to be of deep concern to me. Such forces took form in my first nightmare, which I have never forgotten, although it was nearly 70 years ago. A nightmare I could never tell. It concerned the devil in his home, way down there where the dead people go. Section 2. Now take another leap with me to that same GPS location, that same bedroom, that same bed, but a magic leap by means of words that were deeply frightening to me, words that were haunting. I did not truly understand them, but I repeated them as instructed and as they seemed necessary and unavoidable. They too had a rhythm somewhat like the squinch, squinch. Now I lay me down to sleep. I pray the Lord my soul to keep. If I should die before I wake, I pray the Lord my soul to take. These words carried some meaning, some alarming power, some interweaving of sleep, soul, death, the Lord. A traumatizing abyss opened in my bed where I lay in my cotton pajamas. An uneasiness in the rhythms of the words that seemed so important as Mother and Daddy instructed me. I preferred the texture of the sheets, the plush of my pillow, my book about Zippy the chimpanzee at the side of the bed, my collection of cars and trucks resting silently until the break of the new day. Section 3. And now let us take a hop, skip, and a jump in space and time into a wooden church in Hawkins County, Tennessee, Sawmill Holler, in the country where my ancestors lived and died. This is Oak Grove Baptist Church, the church of my childhood, a Southern Baptist church. Here is another rhythm, more rhyme. Jesus loves the little children, all the children of the world, red and yellow, black and white, they are precious in his sight. Jesus loves the little children of the world. Well, my family, the Dotson family, is a church-going family, a fully churched family. We were not unusual. This was a typical Southern Baptist childhood in America in the 1950s. Every Sunday morning, every Sunday night, prayer meeting every Wednesday night, a revival in the spring, going to church every night for 2 weeks, another revival likewise in the fall, singing and preaching, preaching and singing. And there's not a day in my life now that some hymn does not run through my brain. Words and music, living hymns, ever present, as natural as breathing. I was preached to. Sometimes it feels like 10,000 sermons with 10,000 and more outs and ins, the logic, persuasions and forces and compulsions of a continuous procession of Southern Baptist preachers. Bible studies were continuous with quarterlies from the Baptist Press of the Southern Baptist Convention. There were study materials for Sunday morning, Sunday night, for the week-long study courses, taking up the books of the Bible book by book. There were illustrations with biblical heroes and episodes in the full-color 1950s graphic style. There were baptisms after people got saved, baptisms by full immersion, and if you're not sure what that means, you can Google it, and I'm sure there are thousands of YouTube examples. And the Lord's Supper came when a month had a fifth Sunday. This was communion in the pews with little pellets of bread and tiny glasses of grape juice. These were, of course, only for those who had been saved and baptized. Church socials were regular cookouts in a park with hamburgers, hot dogs, potato salad, cookies and cakes, Pepsis and Mountain Dews, and knee-highs to drink. And there were many funerals in the old style, with heaps of cut flowers sharply fragrant, the immediate smell of the death ritual. I have this book of many photographs of the members of Oak Grove Baptist Church. There you can see some of those photographs. Church of my childhood. I can look in these faces and see family resemblances as I know them through multiple generations. These were the adults of my church family. I knew them by touch, by body heat, by style of dressing up, by the smell of Avon cologne and Old Spice aftershave. I looked up to them. I could name 100 of them right now. Deacons, Sunday school teachers, and women who kept the nursery, who held me on their laps and close to their breasts, women of the Women's Missionary Union. I experienced these adults as humble people of faith, praying sincerely from the heart, doing their best with their life situations. It was a generously loving, nurturing, and affirming environment. I remember in fine detail the night at a revival when I accepted Jesus as my Lord and personal Savior. This was just after I had turned 6 years old in the fall of 1956. I was baptized in the church baptistry on the next Sunday, full immersion. I felt a change. I felt a deepened sense of belonging. I was eager for the next Lord's Supper. There was no politics at church, no politics at all. There was a very strong injunction against that. There were many stories about Roger Williams, the 17th century hero who founded the First Baptist Church in America, a leading advocate of the separation of church and state, one of the key tenets of Baptists in America. Williams also held great respect for the Narragansetts and other indigenous peoples, and became a founder of what eventually became the state of Rhode Island. A living religious hero of my childhood was Billy Graham. He was handsome and charismatic, a father figure. The Baptist preacher on the world stage, stadiums, coliseums. His televised crusades were major events as the family gathered around our Raytheon black and white television. Section 4. The 10,000 sermons varied in content and tone, intellect and emotion from preacher to preacher. The perpetual concern was sin, mostly related to behavioral choices that I didn't know anything about, with very few concrete details about Sodom and Gomorrah, fornication, and so forth. There was a lot of hellfire and damnation, sinners in the hands of an angry God. There were frequent sojourns through the book of Revelation. The second coming and the last things triggered anxieties, much as the earlier refrain, if I should die before I wake. I had a chronic phobia about that the moon and the stars might suddenly, in the twinkling of an eye, start falling out of the sky after an evening worship service. I learned to navigate the King James Bible. I didn't need to use the table of contents, but I could turn to the right place instinctively. I still can. I memorized verses that were assigned to me and many that I chose on my own. This one has stayed with me throughout my life in the King James. For now we see through a glass darkly, but then face to face. Now I know in part, but then I shall know even also as I am known. That's 1 Corinthians 13:12, St. Paul. There are many other verses. I listened closely and I was encouraged to do so. I was never discouraged from asking questions. Among those questions was how the Southern Baptist Convention came to be Southern. The answer I got went no further than this: something about the Civil War and times that were all over and done with. I had no reason to pursue such questions. In my tenure at Andrew Jackson Elementary School, a public school in the city, a seismic shift in my religious development came with the publication of the New English Bible New Testament in 1961. As I was turning 12 years old, I ordered my own copy from the Book of the Month Club. This translation brought fresh perspectives on the King James Version. This was completely fascinating and miraculous to me. Still, there were no reasons to question historical context that I had taken for granted, with such hymns as "My Country 'Tis of Thee," "Our Father's God to Thee, Author of Liberty, to Thee we sing. Long may our land be bright with freedom's holy light. Protect us by thy might, great God, our King." There was no tension and no reason for tension when we sang that song in our public school at Thanksgiving observance. We kids displayed our crayon drawings of pilgrims and Indians and carefully built up our stack of canned and packaged food items for the poor. And finally, all classes, grades 1 through 6, sang together, "We gather together to ask the Lord's blessing. He chastens and hastens his will to make known. The wicked are pressing, now cease from distressing. Sing praises to his name, he forgets not his own." Well, there were no issues then about the separation of church and state, no questions about the history of the indigenous people in our very own specific locale next to the great Holston River, no questions about Andrew Jackson. There were no issues about religious intolerance. There were few Catholics in town, and they had their own school. There were no known Jews in town. And all of us were professed Christians in the Protestant way, or ought to be sooner or later. And there were no blacks to be aware of, since they had their own schools and their own colored section on the other side of town. I don't remember registering at all when "In God We Trust" was established as the official motto of the United States. That was in 1956, by the way, when I was in first grade, the same year I got saved. At some point, I remember asking about the phrases that I saw on the $1 bill, the only denomination that I ever saw much of. I understood these phrases and images appeared on the Great Seal of the United States. I found out what e pluribus unum meant long before I took Latin in high school. Out of many, one. And novus ordo seclorum, a new order of the ages. I paid particular attention to the great eye at the top of the pyramid, the all-seeing eye of God, I had been told. Around the divine eye was the phrase annuit septus, meaning he, God, has favored our undertakings. That unblinking eye was scary to think of, even when I lay myself down to sleep. Equally scary, however, was my core anxiety, as rooted in my soul in the book of Revelation, that atomic bombs could be bursting in air, bringing the whole world to an end with only 15 minutes warning. We had air raid drills, with all of us who lived within walking distance sent home wearing ID tags. There were no further instructions. Entering my teenage years, I found my way to the philosophy section of the public library. There I found books on science, particularly astronomy, and learned about stars that were unlikely to fall out of the sky. I became deeply fascinated with space, with powerful fantasies of space travel that merged with reality when Project Mercury was proclaimed by President Kennedy. Things were beginning to speed up with NASA and the space program, but with the murder of President Kennedy, the whole world began spinning faster and faster. And now a quantum leap to the late 60s through those college years, which were also the years of maximum escalations of the Vietnam War. That era requires its own presentation. I was majoring in philosophy, theology, communications theory. In many ways, these studies were clearly enough extensions of Bible study and the sermons, the preaching of my youth. Then I remember seeing the first image of the whole Earth from space in 1968, and then the moon landing. At this time, I discovered Jean Gebser and C.G. Jung, and a variety of mind-altering experimentations. The powers of rock music were ascendant in full glory. Marshall McLuhan became my guru. And within a few years, I found myself becoming a teacher of creative writing and communications, philosophy and psychology, religious studies and world religions. And through these middle decades of my life, I returned to Oak Grove Baptist Church in many summer times, teaching lessons for my father's men's Bible study class. The adult men of my childhood who were now facing the conclusions of their life journeys. And now they are all gone. We buried Mother in the year 2000, and we buried Daddy 5 years later. I delivered eulogies at both of their funerals at Oak Grove in Sawmill Holler. Thus, for me, came the dawn of the third millennium. You remember that? 2001, A Space Odyssey. Section 5. The prophecy that came to me in my college years in Chicago was this: generations now living are witnessing spiritual changes of magnitude and dimension without precedent in human experience. Generations now living are witnessing spiritual changes of magnitude and dimension without precedent in human experience. That's how I wrote it in 1971, exactly 50 years ago. And now the great acceleration is accelerating. Now we know the great warming is locked in for centuries or millennia. Now the whirlwind, a transmutation of a wearing. Quote, a new consciousness is forming in us, unquote, he says, and he speaks of the numinous. And here I find my present work, and I am grateful for it. I must dig in. There was no psychology in the Oak Grove culture of my childhood. Most of those adults had grown up with scarcities, Southern Appalachian style. Education was scant. Church-going was the primary resource for the meanings of things, family bonds and family injuries, scandal and shame, hardships, abuses and brutalities, hardened hearts. There were no other resources concerning the hidden damages and unmentionable dreams, nightmares, powerful incidents and episodes that could not be spoken, topics that were forbidden, cast into the outer darkness, separated by a lake of hellfire and brimstone. Church was the place to take sorrows and guilts, primordial anxieties, the immediate uncertainties, and the absolute certainties of death. In my early days, the lives at Oak Grove were lived out instinctually, close to the land, linked to the ownership of property or the lack thereof. In the depths of my pondering, it seems to me that much of the fierceness and archaic rage of frontier life had led back to and directly from the abuses of 16th, 17th, 18th century England, Scotland, Ireland, and the caste system of the British Empire. The traumas of those despotisms transmogrified into the distinctly individualistic, expansionist despotisms that required, allowed, and required black chattel slavery. Freed from the royal despot, the pioneer became a personal despot and plantation owner and ordained minister. All too often, the justification was that black slaves were subhuman and could be improved by the good Christian master. And the wealthier and more powerful the master, the larger the indicated the greatness of his righteousness. Having lived my 70 years and now more, I am arriving at a new awareing of the intergenerational trauma, as Samuel Kimball puts it, the cultural complexes that were involved in the world that was put together. I have become aware of what was hidden and denied in the orders of people and places and rituals that I've been talking about. I had a privileged childhood, middle class, lower middle class, but middle class, white. My father had a good and steady job in the local industry. We never went without food or clothing or heat or necessary medical care. Thanksgiving was always a feast. There was no lack of happiness all around and under the Christmas tree. The 4th of July was a parade of flags and World War II veterans of foreign wars, tanks and jeeps. The Mason-Dixon line, the Jim Crow South. Though growing up, I didn't know that term. I never heard that term. I did understand the expression separate but equal, which was actually enshrined in law. The year I started high school was the first year my high school was integrated, without violence, but with tensions that erupted from time to time. Well, my great-grandfather Dotson sat on his porch and read the Bible aloud alone. Or so my father told me as I was in my late 30s. And Father Dotson was born in 1853. He was 8 years old when the Civil War began, 12 years old when it ended, and he became a very religious man, I am told, who strongly identified himself as a Southern Methodist and was ardent with his racist perspective. My father was named after him, John Calvin. I have a photograph of him that I have known all my life. I have it on display and have been contemplating that photograph very intently. But I can't speak with him. Still, I feel certain obligations. I have photographs of another great-grandfather. In one, he is an old man in a rocking chair, holding my father as a baby. This photograph was taken in 1916 as the U.S. was entering the First World War. My father, a baby in long gown. My great-grandfather is wearing his Confederate medal. Word comes down that he wore that medal every day of his life, giving testimony, I suppose, to his valor in the lost cause. I have a photograph of him as a young Confederate soldier with fire in his eyes, sword raised. I remember when Daddy took me as a child to his grave. Well, all of this is really just getting started. Only to introduce some of the work it has been necessary for me to do with the prima materia. The necessary remembrance that comes with newly erupting awaring. Hauntings, let's say. Ghostly matters. I feel temporic disturbances, aberrations of time, as what seemed to be past is actually arriving from the future. I am now 544 pages deep in this 764-page biography. Frederick Douglass, Prophet of Freedom, written by historian David W. Blight, Pulitzer Prize-winning work. Many of Douglass's proclamations from the mid-19th century, in the childhoods of my great-grandfathers and grandmothers, strike very deep within me. When Douglass speaks of the, quote, blood-chilling blasphemy of a nation of liars, unquote, I feel that chill in the roots of my soul. And I feel those lies very, very near to me. Not all over and done with. I hear Douglass speak, quote, the hands of the American church are full of blood, unquote. And he speaks of those Christians who regarded his body and being as chattel, their private property, and proclaimed, quote, I shall hold my slaves and go to heaven too. Speaking in 1845, less than a decade before the man I am named after was born, Douglass says, quote, In America, Bibles and slaveholders go hand in hand. The church and the slave prison stand together. And while you hear the changing of psalms in one, you hear the clanking of chains in the other. During the week fills the pulpit on Sunday. A man becomes more cruel the more the religious element is perverted in him. Unquote. I've studied very closely a text written by a Presbyterian minister of my native ground of the 19th century. This minister argued adamantly that slavery is in very truth ordained by God. The question comes up again and again. And whose God is that? Who might that God be? Well, these are the psycho-historical currents I have come to locate in my East Tennessean cultural complexes. War at every door, as one author puts it. And I've been shocked in years of study to the awareness of how the Civil War in my land was truly brother against brother, father against son, savage brutality among people who in an earlier era could have lent each other a mule if need be. War in every heart it was, I say, and is to this day the theological crisis of the Civil War. The theological crisis of the Civil War, as the evangelical theologian Mark Noll states it. And it was Mark Noll who brought to me the phrase, America's God. The question being, what does God want? Leading directly to the other questions. Whose God is it we are talking about? Whose God is God? This is a dilemma. In so many distinctly American ways, from the beginning, violence somehow became a means of redemption. Creation through destruction. Violence was the sacrificial commitment required to manifest the red, white, and blue American destiny. That myth has always denied its own shadow. That magic spell has been shown to be deadly efficient in its depraved deficiencies. And deeper still are the forces of archaic wounding and archaic rage, timelessly erupting. These are stories that the dead cannot keep silent. How the proclamations of gospel righteousness are perverted as bald-faced lies. It seems a death wish has a controlling hand in the marketplace with all its false promises of happiness and glorification of extravagance as a sacred right and patriotic duty. With the fully cinemastheticized powers of electrical technology, speed-o-light, the imago of Jesus Christ is a white, patriarchal, nationalist, capitalist spectacle, transmogrified in every political act of God Almighty self-righteousness. On a Facebook stream I find these words from anonymous others. I'm trying to figure out your stance here in one conversation. I can't make sense of it. You're telling me that you're a follower of Jesus? And another, so strange how some people are acting. I don't understand. I would say that we are experiencing a multi-dimensional, or I should say, a-dimensional transformation of this God image, America's God. This is very dangerous. A change of God image means a changing of self-image. And these changes are not matters of simple causalities, not simply the products of human agency, not dependent on the capacities or imaginings of our egos, alone or together. These entanglements of truthfulness and untruthfulness, of willful delusion and unconscious delusion. There are severe penalties for mistaken discernments, as Jung spoke very clearly. We swim in the open seas of our discernments, and these are not merely mental reckonings, but mythic journeys, pilgrimages, and magic trances, and the darkness on the face of the deep. What can we speak of the evisceration and evaporation of truthfulness when a state legislature wages war against truthfulness, with, of course, the ruthless veneer and hypocrisy of self-righteousness? This is not only a political transgression, it is a religious transgression. It is a theological crisis. The God of such a state must be a false God, something like the great and powerful Oz with the man standing tall, becoming frantically psychotic behind the curtain. But as psychologist James Hillman puts it, a false God is still a God, requiring some respect for the godlike powers and pretensions on display. Hillman says, idols too are images of gods. We are witnessing the consequences of a mega supercharging idol that thirsts to profit from the spectropolitics of a Christian nationalist white supremacist narcissism. America's God has ordained my lifestyle. My lifestyle mirrors my own free choices, my free will, my self-sovereignty. My God has ordained my self-image just the way it is, just the way I like it, just the way I am living it out. I've got mine. I've earned it. I deserve it. I am making it, and I associate with people who are making it. I have my home, my place, my family, my friends. Don't tread on me, or God has ordained me to get even, to give you the business. I am not interested in your lifestyle or diversity or whatever you call it. My God ordains my politics exactly. My politics are bulletproof. I'm not going any further with this. This little talk is over. In God we trust, buddy. I don't ask for help from anyone. Keep moving. No magnitude of political bluster is going to change the laws of physics. While the changes accelerate, Communities are in chaos, inside and out. It seems we want to destroy ourselves. Will this God get us through our planetary crisis and cataclysm? What are we going to do? What gods shall we choose? Does America have a national God? For Mark Knoll, America's God is, quote, the tragedy of a God defined by American conventions, unquote. And he's an evangelical theologian, I might add. We are in a deep crisis, a turning point in a disease. That's what the Greek crisis means, a decision, a judgment. The Greek word catastrophe is an overturning, a whirling, let's say a whirlwind. A cataclysm, another Greek word, is a deluge, a flood, a washing clean. I arrive at this term, it must be the Baptist in me, cataclysm. America's God in crisis and cataclysm. Does America have a God? Well, in The Invisible Origin, Gebser says, we live, who wouldn't know that, in decisive years. These are all quotes. The impending anarchism, this is Gebser again, the hybrid fanaticism of technical progress, which is directed not only against man and nature, but also against the impact of the denied invisible, that is, the spiritual. This rationalism fights desperately with all thinkable means against the emergence of the new consciousness. It hopes to save itself with this. If it is not successful, it will try to tear everything into its own ruin. Engaging those who try not only to keep a position already lost with all means of power, but to extend it is a tragical challenge necessary to help the new consciousness to emerge. The perception of the origin, the fact alone that it is possible, should draw our attention to the effectiveness of the constellating invisible and liberate us from the illusion that the events are mainly controlled by man. That's all, Gebser. This is important. The transformation of the God image is not caused by or controlled by the mental, rational functions of human agency. This is to speak of the diaphaneity before the beginning and after the end. Gebser, once again. In view of the horrible events occurring all over the world, we must not fall into depression and despair. We should rather realize, or at least become aware that, let's say, spiritual forces, particularly those of charity and love, at first roused in humankind by Jesus Christ, attempt to protect us. That was Gebser. Jung writes late in his life, this is C.G. Jung, as the highest value and supreme dominant in the psychic hierarchy, the God image is immediately related to or identical with the self. And everything that happens to the God image has an effect on the latter. Any uncertainty about the God image causes profound uneasiness in the self, for which reason the question is generally ignored because of its painfulness. But that does not mean that it remains unasked in the unconscious. What is more, it is answered by views and beliefs like materialism, atheism, and similar substitutes which spread like epidemics. They crop up wherever and whenever one waits in vain for the legitimate answer. The ersatz product represses the real question into the unconscious and destroys the continuity of historical tradition, which is the hallmark of civilization. The result is bewilderment and confusion. Close quote. Well, does the fall of the modern age and the destruction of our times hold the seeds of the new creation to be, newness of life, the birthing of an age to be? How will this turn around? My friend Nicholas Brink, who I met at the Gebser in New York quite some time ago, the one you organized, Jeremy, Nicholas quotes Gebser in EPO. Soon we will witness the rise of some potentate or dictator who will pass himself off as a savior or healer and allow himself to be worshipped as such. But anyone who does this in the days to come and is thereby confined to time and is visible in it has nothing to do with the true manifestation of the one who, in time-free transparency, will make the future present. Nick goes on to say, and Nick's about 12 years further along the chronological path than I am. It's such an exciting time. I might be fearing all the craziness that is currently happening, but I am finding it affirming our journey into the era of time-free transparency. And I feel the excitement of this journey. Nick sent me that last night. Well, so it is. I must go and be with my grandchildren and speak to them and listen to them and listen with them. As Gebser says, everything now hinges on knowing when to make things happen and when to let things happen to us. I am reminded of this expression attributed to the Buddha, or to a Buddhist surely. Things are not as they appear to be, nor are they otherwise. Namaste.
Amen.
I hope everybody hasn't passed out. Thank you. Thank you for listening.
Wow, the darknesses that come up when we expand our wearing, they hit us in the face and we have to deal with them. Thank you for that personal journey through this massive American darkness we're all wrestling with now.
I was up until 1:30 last night, which is unfortunately typical of me before Gebser presentations, but it always come down to a late night and editing things down. And then I woke up this morning at 5:30 or so, and I thought, oh God, I can't do this.
Well, I'll tell you, I'm resonating with that right now. I loved your Kierkegaard quote at the beginning. Yeah.
I felt that I couldn't, speak of my great-great-grandfather and my other great-great-grandfather. Again, they're not here to speak for themselves. I'm not their judge. They've both been dead a long, long time. And yet, we're talking about the ever-present origin. We're talking about the ever-present magic, mythic. We're talking with our best mentality, where we have most of our conversations, although Jesse most helpfully brings us all into wider modes of experiencing and sharing and being. But I felt all these things, and again, I don't want to create oppositions. I don't wish to simplify anything or dismiss any soul, living or dead.
John, that was the best representation of, well, that's not the right word, but integration of the mix, the stew of consciousness and how it's all mishmashed together. And that was brilliant. And I want to ask you, do you still feel we're in the deficient integral?
You raise a term that some folks may not even have heard, Mike. You and I have spoken, and some of the others. The deficient integral is quite a notion. Did you mean to say deficient mental rational? Is that what you meant to ask, or did you mean to ask deficient integral?
No, we had talked before about is there a deficient integral? And Gebser would say the efficient comes first, and then it degrades, and then we're dealing with the deficient. But I'm not sure.
I do not. I see these in a Kleinian dynamic. The efficient and the deficient are intermingled at all scales of magnitude in all dimensions: atemporal, amentional, aspatial. And there's what each of us is living with now. Everyone in this conference, all blessings upon you all. How are we living the creation and destruction in our living, our being, our living, our dying of our living, and then for me the shock. And I'm so grateful to Frederick Douglass, who was a very human person. I'm ashamed I didn't know more about him. But I've only got a couple of more 100 pages to go. So anyway, your question, Mike.
I'll get it.
I think where your question leads me is to say each one of us is called into the actual occasions of every breathing in and every breathing out. And decisions such as those that have led us all to be together here right now, atemporally, aspatially. Are we our church? Well, some of you may find that word to be completely unacceptable in any form whatever, and I imagine truckloads of baggage, injury, trauma. However, I am a Christian, and I live with people of my community here. But this does not separate me from anyone. In fact, it leads me to love ever more humbly, respectfully. I am, as Jesse started out, and I started to start out that way, is to say, I generally feel overwhelmed with life, that I can barely contain the energies, vast energies. I'm grateful I can sleep at night. Now I lay me down to sleep. The deficient integral, as with the deficient mental rational, is always, isn't it, going to bring us to pretensions of grandeur, grandiosities, presumptions, rather than encountering one another with humility and compassion.
So can I take up some of Mike, I'd like to just add a little to your question, because I've thought of, like what is the deficient integral, if there is such a thing, and how do we even think about it? And what came to me is that further distinction, thank you, language, it allows us to make these distinctions, that I want to point out that distinctions that are separate or distinct but not separate often. Anyhow, with regard to the deficient integral, what came to me is there can be a hypoform and a hyperform. And so the hypoform is like what's nascent, what is not fully developed yet. It's a not enoughness of the integral, whereas the hyperform, which I think we're seeing in the deficient mental, is too much. It's that form of consciousness hypertrophied to the point where it is no longer really functioning well. And I've got absolutely no clue what the hyper deficient integral might look like. But I sort of see bits and pieces of the hypoform like starting to emerge, like it's just a tender seedling. It's not a full tree yet. And I think it will take, us watering this plant and sheltering it from the onslaught of the destructive mental rational that wants to demolish everything that is not itself.
Yeah, at least I tend to agree about this question of it's such a great question, deficient integral, because it's sort of a challenging notion for us attempting to articulate and make explicit, to render visible the invisible. What could go wrong with that, right? What could be negative about that or deficient? Yet, like you're saying, there is this, like Gebser talks about, this deficient expression in time, in history, of a particular mutation, right? Even the integral, anything that is that bodies forth in historical time and space has this process that, moving through this kind of innovation, creative zenith point, and then rigidifying and overemphasizing and too much of the thing. And that kind of creates this interesting condition for something new to break. But what could be, it's almost a science fiction exercise, like an integral world in which integrality is too much. We're too integral. Things are too transparent. There's not enough separation. There's not enough breaking out. In some ways, there's a kind of mirror, maybe, and we've played around with this in mutations community. There's a kind of mirror maybe with the archaic, right? In the sense of perhaps the integral will be this dormancy for something else to break free, to open up into an incomprehensible cosmos, an unthinkable time. But I don't know if we're not quite there yet, right? We're very much, as you say, in this sort of seed form. But I do think it's something interesting to really ask ourselves. And it helps us distinguish when we're talking about the present, like John was, what is deficient in the present? Is this the integral deficient? Is that actually showing up? Or is this, as John was saying, are you sure you didn't mean atomization and the mental structure, right? Like, how do we cohere and clarify the deficiencies, the overwhelm, the mental rational flood from the incipient integral? It's just, wonderful inquiry. I think Ketchia wants to jump in.
Hello. Wow, that was really amazing, your presentation. Thank you so much. And I just want to bring a reflection on this deficiency. And coming from Brazil, I'm a blend of the three people that colonized, travel to work and build the structures of 500 years, and reminiscence of indigenous that was killed and still remaining people in Brazil that it's starting to bring their voices out, and they call cosmologies that wasn't listened and included as much. Right now, the African people in Brazil is doing the same, and the blend, it's kind of like trying to figure out what this cosmology, cosmogony is about, and seeing similarities. And science is coming to bridge this with the atomic vision of all this cosmology, cosmogony, and indigenous are gathering those information, Africans gathering this information, blended people kind of trying to see through time and space. So what I like to share is this idea of involution and evolution being part of the same way of creation. And when we get into the integral vision, not as a map, but as a perception on this involution to see the root. So we become radical in the seeing, and we have all the emotions that comes with it, because we see that history is not so fair. But at the same time, we are decomposing as the fungi kingdom to destruct that form that was made to be able to generate new life, because that's the nature of the nature we experience in this dimension. So those two forces are always cohabitating to show us the basis and foundation of origin and creation. And this is a temporal transparent and give us the gift of being able to work with this creation and go forward with this ability of vision and compose and work in composition with the intention, with the ability of seeing the other and seeing ourselves in the other, right? So it's kind of like a fifth dimension when we see time and space and the connections that makes all of it as form. So I think that's hope, because when we are able to see things trickling down, we are able to see the foundations of creation, and we are working towards this decomposition. And it's part of the whole thing. Thank you so much for sharing your heart. You know, I feel it really, really deeply.
I think you speak most adeptly, Kesia. I'm always reminded of the work of Dr. Sabina Spielrein and her work, Creation as the Source of Coming to Be. It is a mental, rational effort to divide creation from destruction and to create a permanent order that is somehow fixed. So this is where we are living. This is where we are breathing. And you just said it, you know, we are living creation and destruction at all scales of magnitude, in all dimensions, atemporally. We are working together aperspectively as best we can. Thanks be for the opportunity we have here.
John, I just wanted to thank you because I feel like you know, your whole talk was a making transparent, and you know, you took something from the past and made it present, and then the sharing of your own experience, and then the juxtaposition with that of Frederick Douglass. I mean, it was just like, you know, this idea of like an act of integrality, I think, of just like bringing everything and making it translucent. And you know, and hearing like how beautifully you brought that to life, and then having also a sharing of your own, I don't know, inner landscape and inner world and inner way of growing up. It's like, wow, what an alchemical process for you then now in this part of your life to be shining a spotlight on the very idea of God and Jesus, and you know, these terms that in your childhood were sacrosanct. So anyway, so I'm deeply appreciative, and I have a whole new sense of Christian as a result of you speaking. So just wanted, yeah, thank you. That's just wanted to share that. Thank you.
Thank you, Jesse, and again, thank you, everyone. I appreciate the opportunity to work my material, but to offer my material for your good purposes, whatever they may be. It's very hard. I'm actually on the edge of tears, sort of feeling the energy flows, atemporal energy flows. You know, wanting to say more, knowing that whatever order I come up with is just an order of the moment, but it's offered freely, and again, I'm grateful for the opportunity to be with each and every one of you, wherever you are.
So if there are no more questions or comments, what I'd like to do is I'd like to see if there are any folks from any of the European communities who have already had their local gathering today and would like to share anything about what went on there. Do we have anybody?
I haven't heard back from the cohort there for this week. But if anybody is listening who I'm not familiar with their name, just send me a note. Would love to have everyone on and do a little share. But I sense that might be next week or the week after, to be closer to Hammerly's presentation. Yeah.
Okay, so should we take another little 5-minute stretch break and then come back? Now, originally we did not have the next presenter on the schedule, but you know the way life works, things happen, and Karen Voorhees came to us and said, you know, is there any way she could? Her local group was canceled, and so could she present? And so I said, well, our local group here in Monterey needs something, and since I'm also the one whose Zoom connection we're using, it's going to be on, you know, right here. So if anybody wants to stay here, we're going to have how shall I call it, Karen, a dramatic presentation. It's going to be, let's say, immersive. And that will be right here on this same Zoom channel. If you want to stick around. Now, if you have a local group that has things planned and wants to get onto those, please do that. Jeremy, you said something about making Zoom links.
Yeah, just quickly, if there are groups that want to go have a fun after party, a Gebserian, get their Gebser on with an after party salon on Zoom, they're more than welcome to do that. And if they want to invite folks, send either Lisa or myself a note. I didn't receive any links today, so I don't think we're wanting to disperse. Maybe we all want to stick here for this first weekend. But if you are feeling so called, please let us know, and we're happy to announce that and push that link out to everyone, even through email, before we get started, so folks know where to go. But yeah, keep that in mind for next week too.
Okay, so why don't we take another 5, and then we'll come back for Karen's presentation.